Subscribe to Iron Age instincts if you value serious historical knowledge that actually holds up under pressure. Because what we're covering today is not trivia, not romance, and not fantasy. This is hard-earned navigation knowledge that kept Viking-age people moving across hostile landscapes without maps, compasses, satellites, or roads. If you care about real-world resilience, this matters. What most people get wrong about Viking navigation is that they think it was crude or instinctive. It wasn't. It was engineered. The opening minute of this discussion is critical because once you understand this, you'll never look at primitive navigation the same way again. Vikings did not wander. They planned. They read land like a living document. They memorized routes not as lines on a map, but as sequences of physical truths. A ridge meant wind exposure. A marsh meant fog at dawn. A stand of birch meant water nearby. Their navigation system was embedded in the environment itself, and that's why it still works when everything modern fails. The first thing to understand is how Vikings treated the landscape as a structured system rather than empty space. Norse travellers divided terrain into functional zones, not abstract regions. High ground was for orientation and long-distance movement. Low ground was for shelter, water access, and concealment. Coastlines, rivers, and valleys were treated as movement corridors. If you were travelling inland during the Viking Age, you weren't cutting straight across forests. You were moving ridge to ridge, valley to valley, always keeping a known feature within sight or memory range. To apply this today, practice moving through your local terrain by linking visible landmarks into sequences rather than relying on GPS routes. Walk a route once and describe it out loud using only physical features, then repeat it days later without digital aids. Sun position was not used casually. It was disciplined and habitual. Vikings tracked the sun not just by direction, but by height, shadow length, and seasonal behaviour. A traveller knew how long a shadow should be at specific times of day during specific months. This allowed them to maintain heading even under partial cloud cover. To practice this skill, choose a fixed object like a staff or tree, observe its shadow at the same times across several days, and record the change. Over time, you'll develop a reliable internal clock tied to solar movement rather than devices. So, the stars actually mattered less for land travel than people often assume, but they were definitely used deliberately when visibility allowed. Polaris, for example, was more of a stability reference than a guide pointing the way forward. Vikings didn't, walk toward the North Star. Instead, they used it to confirm their orientation before setting out. This distinction is really quite critical. Before heading out at night, they would stop, check their alignment, and then move on with confidence. You might try this yourself. Before a night walk, pause, establish north using the stars or the arc of the moon, and then move along, rechecking your direction from time to time instead of constantly correcting your course. Now, one of the most overlooked Viking navigation tools was sound. Wind moving through certain types of terrain actually creates predictable noise patterns. Water, as well, carries sound differently depending on the slope and the surrounding vegetation. Experienced travellers could, quite impressively, identify their distance from rivers or settlements by auditory cues alone. In foggy conditions, sound would often replace sight. To put this into practice, try stopping during your hikes and identifying water, roads, or even animals just by listening, and then confirm visually afterward. Over time, you'll notice your accuracy improves dramatically. Memory systems were really the backbone of Viking navigation, and they were trained quite deliberately. Routes were stored as stories, not measurements. A journey, for example, might be remembered as from the split stone to the bent pine, across the wet ground where boots sink, then up the hill where the wind cuts from the west. This way of narrative encoding made routes resilient to change. If a tree fell, the story still held. To use this today, just describe routes verbally in sequence, rather than thinking in distances or turns. This builds redundancy into your navigation. Weather reading was inseparable from movement planning. Vikings could delay travel based on cloud behavior hours before storms arrived. They knew, for instance, how fog pooled in valleys and cleared on ridges. They adjusted routes dynamically rather than forcing schedules. Modern, grid-down travel, honestly, demands the same flexibility. Start by learning how your local weather behaves around specific landforms and adjust departure times accordingly instead of pushing fixed plans. What makes Viking-era land navigation powerful today is that it scales. It works alone or in groups, in forests or open ground, and it requires no tools that can fail. It forces you to engage with terrain honestly. The more complex the environment, the stronger the system becomes. If this kind of grounded, historically accurate knowledge matters to you, subscribe to Iron Age Instincts and share this with others who are serious about learning how people actually survived and moved through the world before modern infrastructure. This is, truly, how old knowledge stays alive.